Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Integrative You Radio. I am here with Dr. Nick, and we are talking about a really fun topic today. I think I say that every single time because I'm such a dork and I get so excited about everything we talk about.
This is all true. It's all
It is all
true.
relevant. Well, I think that it's something, it's safe to say that especially post pandemic, but don't get me wrong, there are so many other layers to this that there are a lot of people that feel pretty isolated, people that feel lonely. And and I say there's other aspects of this primarily because you and I both as entrepreneurs, we've been in a lot of different coaching programs and that was a theme of conversation. And it was especially a theme of conversation when you were first getting started in a program of, hey, let's address the elephant in the room that, you know, you as entrepreneurs kind of feel like you're on your own little mountain, trying to get to the top and you feel isolated, you feel alone because not a lot of people can relate to the pain points that you're experiencing in entrepreneurship. And then on top of that, we experienced a pandemic, which created isolation for people, like literally created isolation for people. And then there's a similar dynamic when it comes to individuals that we've worked with that have had mystery illness or chronic illness, and people don't understand. Doctors will say to them, it's in your head, your labs look fine. Their family members can't relate. They don't understand how someone could be so sick or someone could be bedridden or someone could have such low energy. And there's a level of isolation with that. And sometimes that isolation is mental and sometimes it's physical and sometimes it's both.
Yes, when you're talking about that, I saw both directions. I was wondering if, because initially I think of like that loneliness causes you to be sick.
Of course.
A big portion of it. But I was like, I'm always trying to look at things as a balance of like, well, how's that benefiting the person? It's not just a bad thing. And I was like, oh, you go out to eat, and we're probably attracting it from who we are, but we always hear people complaining about health issues and this and that. And it's
The beauty of
interesting
not
that
necessarily knowing the Italian language that well, because we live in Italy now, and I can tune all that out.
but it'd be interesting if unconsciously it's like the sickness is just a different tool for that person to not be lonely, because sickness brings a lot of people together.
100%. There is definitely an element of people that feel alone or isolated, and it's maybe because they have had difficult relationships with family, friends, and they're choosing to isolate themselves. That can 100% create sickness. And then there is sickness that can then create that type of loneliness and isolation. But as mentioned, sometimes that's happening for a reason because the people that are in your life maybe are more superficial relationships. Maybe they're more toxic to your psyche than you realize, which is kind of the topic that we're getting into today. Um, you and I had conversations together, but then there were also conversations with in two completely different arenas of life that brought up this phrase that we always say that conflict avoided is conflict multiplied. And it's one of the reasons why you and I have a weekly meeting, just necessarily about the business. It's you and I about our own personal accomplishments and failures, and then also how we are showing up for each other as a couple.
Yeah, I was actually talked a lot about this with a client yesterday, and she's like you, type A, uh, CEO energy. And I was like, you have meetings in business, you have meetings with your team, you have meetings, all this, and why? It's so you don't have to deal with fires later. It's all preventative. It's so you can keep everything growing in alignment. I was like, you're not doing that with your partner? I was like, what the fuck? I was like, that makes zero sense. I go, just step back and see, you want your romantic relationship to go as well as work does, but you don't want to do the things that cause work to be so successful. Like you're not going to have a successful relationship
But
if
people go into this idea that that's bad. I've had this conversation with people, men and women. It's not one more than the other. And they're like, but a relationship should flow. A relationship shouldn't be that hard. And I'm like, that's not the point. It's about this is one thing that I think none of us
it
have been
does
taught.
flow and it is easy when you're preventative.
When you are actively communicating. And so one of the things that we're going to bring to you guys today is we want to bring you, when we talk, this some of this is theory. These are things that we're sharing with you based off of our clinical experience, our clinical observations, our experience as humans, navigating life, navigating family dynamics, navigating relationships. And then there's also these, I don't want to call it science, but there are these methodologies and these frameworks that have been created and proven. So one of the frameworks that I was thinking of that I learned in my business coaching certifications was by Patrick Lencioni. And what I loved about him is that he is big on the people side of business. And he's like, you are nothing without your people. And listen, for those of you that are super into AI and technology and this and that, and this is Nick, that are like, oh, all businesses are going to be run by AI in the future, whatever, that's fine. But at the end of the day, if you were to just interact with AI and you have no relationships in your life, you're not going to feel overly satisfied or fulfilled. So working with humans, speaking with humans, relationships with humans, it's going to affect you in some way or another. And some of the most successful visionary companies have figured out how to create really amazing company culture, which is based on their people. And that is why they're successful. That's what they attribute their success for, or to, I should say. And so I found that there's so many interesting aspects of how does this flow into family? How does this flow into romantic relationships? Because at the end of the day, when you hear people complain about their aunt, their mom, their dad, their kids, their husband, their wife, if you were to zoom out, it's all communication,
This
understanding issues.
discommunication in that instance.
100%.
That's the same thing with the body, though. It's like if there's an area of the body not functioning properly, it's just because there's not proper communication going from whether that's a hormone or a neurotransmitter into a cell, et cetera. There's a break or the wrong communication, and then we call it that the body's breaking down or something's wrong, but it's just figuring out where that break in communication is and why.
100%. And so, speaking of this idea, I'm going to give you two high level stories that are going to really segue into what we want you guys to gain from this podcast. And both of them happened this week. So one was between myself and a client, call them a patient, we call them members. And so this was more, it was a working relationship, a business relationship. And essentially the theme of conflict avoided is conflict multiplied came up. And the reason being is that this person was having some issues, they were having some feelings, they were having some frustrations. And for myself, as being the leader of their care, I addressed it immediately. I said, we're not going to let this frustration, conflict, overwhelm fester. We're going to get on a face to face call. We're going to communicate in a very strategic and humble way. And we're going to come up with some very specific clarity and resolutions. And so in the past, this is something that maybe I wouldn't have had time to do. This is something that I would have maybe avoided because it would have been uncomfortable. And taking kind of the bull by the horns and having a difficult conversation is something that not only empowered myself, but also empowered the other individual and also yielded solutions and was quickly able to rectify a situation. The most important thing is that there was a level of trust that was built that maybe was there, but it wasn't strong. And
When
so, go ahead.
trust, I think people have a wrong relationship with trust.
Or like
Um,
a wrong definition.
yeah, I guess you could call it that. I look at trust as trust. You trust somebody when like they keep their word or they do these things, but like really when you think about it, it's like trust, a lack of trust occurs when one party doesn't win. One party gets hurt. That's when you lose trust.
Like an unfair exchange, you mean?
Correct.
Yeah.
So your phone call, what you had, it was a candid conversation, was not quote unquote easy, but the trust was built because the time, the energy, and the space to create a win-win. And it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, you talked about the clarity, but I really want people to understand that clarity was so that there could be a win-win. And that's what builds trust for people, that
It
you're
was
taking the time.
there was an opening. It wasn't the me show. It wasn't, I'm here to give you all of your solutions and address your problems. There was an open platform for her to speak up and for me to speak up and to bring, both perspectives to the table and then be able to talk about it and resolve it. So what you're saying is actually very, very important because a lot of times when this idea of conflict avoided is conflict multiplied, you know, the last thing that we want you to gain from this conversation is that, oh, don't tolerate, just go in and tell them how you feel.
Guns blazing. No, no,
Yeah,
no.
that there's a lot of people that do that already, and it does not get them very far. And so, actually, you kind of set me up here because the second time that I brought up conflict avoided, conflict multiplied was in a conversation that I was having with a friend of ours here in Italy in relation to his relationship with his brother. And, you know, there was a lot in the conversation, there was a lot of pushback in what I was saying, primarily because he was like, he's a difficult man, he has, his own mental illness, he has these issues, he's very narcissistic, he doesn't care about what I have to say, like it's his way or the highway. There was a lot of rebuttals, and essentially what I wrapped it up with, I was like, listen, this is not about you going in and putting on a presentation for your brother that in that moment he's going to be like, holy shit. He's 45, his brother is I think 50. 50 years of operating a certain way, thinking a certain way. You're not changing that in one conversation. Like that's not the goal. The goal is that you show up in such a confident but humble way, in such a methodical way, because you thought about how you're going to show up, and you do it in a way that the person is almost like a little surprised. And I say humble because when you start to get emotional or fuck you, like, the person's going to shut down. They're not going to listen to you. They're going to laugh. They're just going to be like, "What a joke! This is you pulled the same card you always do." So it's you show up in this confident way with conviction, with passion for that win-win, but you maintain that level of humility because your goal is you really do want a positive outcome or an outcome altogether. You're not just like, I'm just here to bitch and moan. And I said, but if you do this, don't expect something in that moment. Don't sit there and say, I'm going to show up in such a powerful way that he's going to completely respond to me differently than he ever had. Like, go in with no expectation to say, I'm here for me, for me to potentially speak in a way that I've never been able to be as vulnerable as possible, to share my truth, but I want to do it in a humble way because I'm looking for the outcome to be a stronger foundation for us, more trust between us. And if the person takes it, great. If the person doesn't, great. You have to be okay with either outcome. But the way that I look at it is if they're still thinking about that conversation afterward, that's a win. So you might see a different outcome or an outcome altogether. It could be a month from then. It could be 6 months from then. It could be a year from then because it's about that person and their processing of how you showed up and the conversation that was had. So I think that it's really, really important for people to understand that one, you don't just go in guns blazing. And then two, this is about addressing conflict as a win-win situation, as you said, Dr. Nick, and also with a level of humility and a level of confidence that maybe you haven't shown in the past.
I was taking notes. I like to try to break everything down as simple as possible to see, and
I
then it's
love it.
like,
Let's do it.
okay, I get it. So I wrote down the goal is trust.
Yes.
And trust is created from a win-win relationship. Or you could say the degree of trust, because nothing's black and white. So the degree of trust is the degree of that win-win. And if everybody's winning evenly, there's maximal trust. But if one person starts losing or another person starts winning more, well, that there's a little bit of imbalance of trust there. That win-win is, like you said, it's only created by being vulnerable and methodical. So you have to have a strong, clear intention of what the goal is to not get derailed, but to be, like you said, humbled, grounded, centered, and that vulnerability allows to stay in that middle road, to not jump up to, you know, the over or under of gaining or losing, which takes away from trust. That vulnerability allows you to have the communication or the discommunication. And if you have the communication with the vulnerability and everything else, you have the trust. But if on the opposite side, if you don't have any of that, that takes you to being lonely and sick.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you essentially encompassed some aspects of the pyramid from Patrick Lencioni. And so I want to
I
share
mean,
a
we're both brilliant men. So it's I haven't read any of his books, but you love him. So
his work is really fantastic. And again, I think that part of my attraction to it was I wanted to I wanted to build a really great business and I knew that experience for our clientele was a big part of that. And in our model, experience was going to be dictated by the people that we had. And so I wanted to put a lot of my focus into my people opposed to, talking about spreadsheets and numbers and profit and loss. We needed to address those parts. But if you're trying to address that and not address your people, you're going to have a lose-lose situation. And but as I learned this, and I do think it's actually one of the reasons why we felt like there was an easy segue into parenting is, we had this major crash course in people and how people operate, and it's actually flowed tremendously into how we show up in our relationship, but also in our parenting as well. But he says some things that are just really interesting of, if you don't have the trust, you're going to have fear of conflict. So you have people fearing the bringing hard conversations to the table. And we all know this. We know there are certain people in our lives where we're like, I'm not even gonna do it. Like, I'm not gonna have the like, I know how they're gonna react. Like, I know they're gonna lose it, or they're gonna be mad, or they're gonna take it personally. And you just avoid the conversation. And it's because there's a lack of trust. And I'm sure that individual who's extremely reactive, they have a lack of trust inside of themselves. It's not really just external. But if you have a lack of trust, you have this roadblock on the ability to have these hard conversations, then there is going to be a lack of commitment and a lack of accountability. You think about it, it's like if you have a person in your life that they are you can't be yourself, you can't be vulnerable, you can't have transparent deep conversations with them because they're so reactive, you're not going to be overly accountable to showing up to their birthday party. You're not going to be overly accountable to show up when they quote unquote need you, because there's no reciprocation. It's not a win-win. It's
Yeah,
like it
but I'd
it
say
ends up being the them show.
the only thing that I think people don't understand is that's what they want. They want that deep connection if they want to put in the work for a deep conversation, all these things to be vulnerable and have more of that tightness and trust. But you start different. You start in a different place with every single person. Like
Yeah.
it's easy to compare, like, oh, I had this with this person. I wish I could have it with them. And it's like they're different people. You have a different relationship with them. You're gonna have a different starting point. You can't compare one relationship with another because it's a completely different entity. So you have to go into it with like that emptiness of like, okay, this is where we're gonna start growing. You go out to a field and you could get lucky and one field is already had been tilled and beautiful. The other field might need a lot of cleanup work first before you can get to that.
Yeah.
It's all relative to your judgment. So stop judging because that's holding you back from being vulnerable and allowing you to actually start working on the relationship.
Well, I think it's huge what you said, because what I was just describing is essentially what it looks like when a relationship is not built on trust, but that doesn't mean that you, as the individual, as potentially the growth-minded individual, hence why you're listening to this podcast, that doesn't mean that you can't be a part of shifting that dynamic. Because the individuals that are reactive and they're not willing to have hard conversations, they kind of throw their emotions all over the place, like, those are wounded people deep down. They want a quality relationship, they just don't know how. And it's not your journey to fix them by any means, but if they are a person that's important to you, you can show up in a certain way, a vulnerable way, and you can also show up with the intention of that win-win. And that could potentially deepen the trust with that individual. This is essentially the conversation that I was having with our friend here in Italy about his brother. I'm like, it's not for you to fix him or change him. That's his own journey. But you can show up in a certain way to kind of, what's that phrase? Extend. I always fuck these up. The olive branch? I don't know. But it's like you can be really happy with how you showed up and extend that invitation.
That olive branch.
He might take it, he might not. But at least for you, you know that you tried. And, again, we can't take responsibility for other people, but there are ways that we can show up that will deepen trust, even with people that have been a bit difficult in our lives.
So wrapping it up, you might not be lonely and sick now, but life is like a roller coaster. And we can either better understand this concept to help ourselves in the future if we do, and or like Dr. Nicole said, be able to change how we interact with somebody that is lonely and sick because now we kind of understand more of the process of how and why they got there. And if we want to grow that trust and we want to grow that relationship, um, it's like you said, it's not science, but there's really a methodology to be able to create trusting strong relationships.
Yeah, and I invite you guys to think about quality over quantity. You know, there are definitely people that are like, I'm not lonely. This is totally irrelevant to me. I have so many friends and I have a huge family. And that's great. But, you know, when you really look at the quality of those relationships, you know, are these people that you feel a fair exchange with? Or are these people that you find yourself resenting at certain times because there is an unfair exchange? You know, are these people the people that are going to be your quote unquote ride or die? You know, if you need something or you're, you know, dealing with some turmoil, you know, are they there to have your back or are they really just there when, you know, you're having a birthday party at your house? So, you know, these are all things to consider. And really, if you are an entrepreneur and a business owner, you have to understand that avoiding conflict with your customer and avoiding conflict with a bad review, avoiding conflict with an employee, it's always going to blow up later. Some of it will blow up quickly, some of it will take a while. So it's really important for you, if you are a founder of the company, if you are, you know, someone in charge leading the company, which if you are an entrepreneur, you are that person. It doesn't matter if you've hired a COO or a CEO, you are still the leader to those leaders. And it's important for you to not only encompass this yourself, but it's also to have your leaders, managers, directors, whatever you want to call them, encompass this because this allows people to feel heard. It deepens the trust. It avoids problems blowing up that cascade into other parts of life and business. It's really, in our experience, one of the key factors to better family dynamics, better business practices, and also just feeling like you are showing up as a leader. You're showing up in the best way that you can for the people around you.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate goal is just to live an awesome, amazing life. And you can't do that without maximizing each one of your buckets. So it's a great tool.
All right, guys. Until next time.